Good evening. Have you ever had a really important, pivotal event in your life, perhaps a decision that you made the day you decided to take a new job, or perhaps the day that you asked that young lady to marry you, or the day that you gave birth, maybe as a woman, to your first child, or the day that you gave your daughter away in marriage? Important, special, pivotal days that you might never forget as long as you live. You replay that in your mind and you think about the impact that that event had on your life over the years looking back. Well, the Israelites had such an event in their lives. Let's go to Exodus, and we begin in chapter 12, and we're going to read a few of the passages that lead up to the departure from Egypt. The departure from Egypt toward the end of chapter 12 is the special event that is commemorated and remembered by what we're doing this evening, but it's important to get a bit of background on what exactly was happening, because these are dramatic days for the Israelites. We see in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. And so speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of the month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. And your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. And you shall take it from the sheep or from the goats." So we read verse 6. It says, "Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. And then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight." So we understand that the Passover, this ceremony that is described here in Exodus chapter 12, happened as the 14th day of the first month began. As the sun set and the 14th began, it was time for the Passover. And we read, as we continue throughout the rest of this chapter, we read of what happened on that evening. Verse 7, he says, "They shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. And then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it." And it describes more of how it shall be prepared and how it shall be eaten. But it says, verse 11, "And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste," or with a sense of urgency. It is the Lord's Passover. So as they took the Passover that evening, very important event for them, that particularly was crucial because the blood on the doorpost and the lintel was the sign that they were God's and they would be protected from the death angel that evening. But as they kept that Passover and as the night continued, again, on the beginning of the evening of the 14th, and followed these instructions, things were going to change very quickly. Because as that day, as they came to the daylight portion of that day, we read that they were going to be preparing to leave Egypt, something that they had longed for years, as they suffered under the rule of the Pharaoh and all the cruelty that he brought upon them. So that evening, as they kept the Passover, as they ate the lamb, they were instructed to eat it in preparation for something else that was to happen, and something else, by the way, that they were to remember as an historic event for years to come. So we see verse 12, "I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." And as I mentioned, it goes and describes how they were to put the blood on their homes. And verse 14, "This day," he says, "shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance." So they were not to forget the importance of that night. For them, it was a historic event. It was something that actually had meaning, because this was to be the night that something dramatic happened. And as they went through the years to come into the future, they were to look back on this night and to memorialize this night because of what happened on that night. So it was an important historic event. Now we can apply this to ourselves, and when we keep the Passover year by year, we recognize it's certainly a historic event in terms of Israel, but we recognize its meaning for us spiritually as a memorial of our commitment through baptism and then the laying on of hands, the commitment to Jesus Christ, a spiritual, you might say, a spiritual event in our lives that is, we have a type provided for that by what we're reading right here. So very important, the Passover is very important in terms of what we remember, just like the Israelites as they were to remember. But the story continues. The account continues here as you go through through chapter 12. It describes how they were to take the blood and put it, in verse 22, take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in a basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. So here we have a bit of a timetable that they were to stay in their homes throughout that night. But yet, as the day began, as the daylight portion began, there was something that was supposed to happen. And so we read in verse 31, as that night wore on, and after midnight, when we read in verse 29 and 30, that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. After that happened, after midnight now, as we progress through the evening, during the dark portion of the night, we read that Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. And also take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now, when they did this was not during the previous night, but it was actually then, would have been during the daylight portion of the 14th day. And we see how they did according to, as they had been instructed. The children of Israel, verse 35, had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and articles of clothing. Some say that had already begun to take place even before this point, this morning, and it likely could have continued as or already been in motion as some of the people of the land of Egypt said, "We want you out of here. Here, take what we have, be gone." So it could have already begun, but certainly that morning they took that had been given to them, and they began to rendezvous with other of the children of Israel and gather for the journey out of Egypt. In other words, that was the purpose of death angel passing over and God visiting this plague upon the Egyptians. As the other dramatic plagues, the purpose was to release them from bondage from Egypt and send them out of the land. Now that's important because as we keep the Passover, we recognize that's only a first step in a process. The first step and a critical step, an important step. But that's not where it ends. The reason Christ died, the reason He sacrificed for us is actually moving us forward, and that is to remove us out of sin, to help us to take this journey out of sin. So as we gather together on this evening, this evening is about the next step past the Passover, past our baptism. And it's a memorial not of our commitment to Christ, but our journey out of sin. And that's what we read here as we go forward. And that's why it's an important evening. We need to remember as we observe this evening and as we memorialize this evening, as we remember this evening that we're keeping now, we do remember that this evening has special meaning of and by itself. It's the meaning that is tied to the first day of unleavened bread. A time when we focus our attention on going out of Egypt, removing sin from our lives and removing ourselves from sin. And so it's the next step in the process. So very important, and it's important that we focus on that lesson as we gather together with our brethren this evening, who also, by the way, are in their journey together with us out of sin. The Israelites didn't go out one by one. They went out as a body. They were saved and prepared to leave Egypt as a body, as a people, encouraging one another. And that's what we do this evening. So we see that during the course of the day then, the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot besides children. And verse 38, we see a mixed multitude went up with them also in flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock, and they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor they prepare provisions for themselves. So we see this is now charting the fact that they left Egypt, now not on the night of the 14th, but actually we see that they left the next day. Let's read a little bit further here. We see verse 40, the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years, and it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Now it says, it actually points to a night now in the next verse. So let's focus on that for a moment. So it says, it is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. So, although we read here a couple of verses later about them journeying from Ramses to Succoth, when did that begin? During the course of the day of the 14th, they were preparing themselves, but as we read in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 1, they actually went out by night, not the Passover night, the night before. They were commanded to stay in their homes or face death by the hand of the death angel. This is the next night, the night of the 15th, as the 15th began. We read that over in Deuteronomy chapter 16. Deuteronomy chapter 16, and we read here verse 1, observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover to the Lord your God, for in the month of Abib the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. It wasn't the night of the 14th, it was the night of the 15th. How do we know that? Well, let's look at another verse here. Let's go to Numbers chapter 33. Numbers chapter 33 and verse 1. These are the journeys of the children of Israel who went out of the land of Egypt by their armies under the hand of Moses and Aaron. Now Moses wrote down the starting points of their journeys at the command of the Lord, and these are their journeys according to their starting points. They departed from Ramses in the first month, and what does it say then? Not on the 14th, certainly not on the night part of the 14th when they were in their homes, protected from the death angel, keeping the Passover, or even on the daylight part of the 14th. But it says, verse 3, they departed from Ramses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month. On the day after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with boldness in the sight of all the Egyptians. So this evening, as we begin the 15th of the first month, the 15th day of the first month, the first day of unleavened bread, we are memorializing, we're remembering the journey of the Israelites out of Egypt and what it symbolizes for us as we journey out of spiritual Egypt. Now we have an emphasis, if we go back to Exodus chapter 13, we have in Exodus 12 the point, verse 42, I'll read that again, Exodus 12 verse 42, it is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. So it's a solemn observance, it's a time when certainly there was joy for them to leave, but there was also death in the air. There was also this recognition of the destruction that had been visited upon the Egyptians, and also in a sense you might think of how close they were to death as well. If they had not put themselves in the hands of the eternal, if they had not had faith in God, they would have suffered the same fate. But no, by the hand of God they were saved and brought out, and now they were, you might say they were taking a leap of faith to follow God out into the wilderness. And so it was a joyous time, but it also had a weightiness to it. And that's similar to us, isn't it? Because as we gather together on this evening, we're happy and we're joyous to be part of God's people, be part of God's work. We enjoy this time together. It's important that we do fellowship with each other and we gather together with our brethren this evening. But there's also a certain weight of responsibility, and there's a weight of thankfulness. Passover here on the previous evening, there's a sense of solemnity, even while there's deep thankfulness, and there's not sadness, but there's a certain solemnity that is part and parcel of the Passover. This night, we can, if we're not careful, we can forget that there should be a depth of thankfulness, and also a certain weight of responsibility and of the meaning of this evening that should weigh on us as well. So as we go through the evening, we should think about our journey out of Egypt. We should talk about the challenge of coming out of Egypt, coming out of sin, coming out of our former life, staying out. If we've grown up in the church, perhaps you might say, well, I'm not coming out of Egypt. I grew up in the church. But there's a constant battle on a daily basis to come out of the influence of the world around us. We all experience that. And so the challenge, the weight, the stress of coming out of the world on a daily basis weighs on us all. Through God's help and through God's strength, we can do it, just like the ancient Israelites could leave Egypt and leave that behind them. But there's a weight to this evening that should not be forgotten. And it specifically tells us not to forget it as we read the next chapter. So Exodus chapter 13, we read in verse 3. So Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten." It says, "On this day you are going out in the month Abib. And it shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and of the Hittites and the Amorites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in this month." It reminds them to memorialize their departure from Egypt. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no leavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all your quarters. And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, "This is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt." We need to remember, and we need to pass on the lesson, pass on the importance of our departure out of spiritual Egypt. And we need to emphasize that with our children and reinforce with each other the importance and the appreciation we have for that lesson, for that reality. It's not something that we can just have by osmosis. Unless we think about it, unless we talk about it, unless we rehearse it with each other, then it becomes meaningless to us. And the meal that we eat together only becomes simply just another meal. But it's a special meal. It's an important meal. It's the beginning of the days of unleavened bread. And how thankful we can be that God has given us the instructions to have this reminder for our benefit, so we don't forget, and also as a mechanism to teach our children and to remind each other as brethren. So he says, verse 9, "It shall be as a sign to you on your hands and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth." That we rehearse, we talk about it, we speak about it. "For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt, and you shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year." God brought the Israelites with a strong hand out of Egypt, and He does the same for us in terms of spiritual Egypt today. if we'll only look to Him, if we'll be faithful to Him, if we'll observe His commandments, and if we'll properly observe this evening, this special night to be observed, night to be remembered, and memorialize that, make that special for us, just as He commanded the ancient Israelites, but with a greater, a deeper spiritual lesson that is attached to it. So enjoy the night to be much observed, and enjoy the days of unleavened bread.